So we welcome the young and children and the young at heart today to share in a young people's message. You probably heard the reading, and it talked about a vineyard. It talked about people that were hired to work in the vineyard. It talked about unequal pay in the vineyard. And so I kind of thought back to my childhood, a little bit about my understanding of pay and money. And my sister and I used to get allowances. And Grace kind of assured me that probably young people still get allowances of some sort, right? But I remember I got a quarter allowance, and this when I was about 12 years old. Think about that, a quarter isn't much money now. And my sister was a teenager, so she would have been 17 years old, and I remember she would get $5 every week for an allowance. And I always thought to myself how unfair that was, that my sister would get $5 and I would get a quarter. You know, and there's a lot of other ways to kind of give allowances. I don't know how many of you use old school checks. I think a few people might use these. I probably write one check a month. These are checks in case you haven't seen checks for a while. I don't even have a case for my checks because they never go anywhere with me. And then, of course, we use credit cards. This is my credit card. This is the church's credit card. And this is a gift card. And some of you may have gotten some of those for Christmas that you can buy anything you want with it. But what was interesting in the story today is that there was an unfair payment or unfair wage, kind of like my sister getting $5, I got a quarter, but as I got older, of course, I got a bigger allowance. But I think the beauty of the story is they went into a vineyard to work, right? And back in the day, back in Jerusalem in Israel, where the story was written, they grew grapes, like we grow grapes around Arizona. And they would grow grapes, and they would have to have people come into the vineyards where the grapes were growing and pick the grapes. And then for the most part, they not only ate the grapes, but they also turned the grapes into wine. And there were some workers that had worked all day, probably 10 or 12, 15 hours in the vineyard. And then there were some that just worked a short day and only worked 4 or 5 hours. They got there late, and they didn't work as late, and they got less pay. They didn't get equal pay. And so it was really frustrating for the workers, but it does talk about in this story about generosity, about giving gifts, about a fair wage. And it also talks about the last will be first and the first will be last. Kind of a strange story and a strange ending to the story. But I think the key to the story is that we shouldn't necessarily be consumed or overtaken with money, right? Or that money shouldn't become the object of our love and our desire, that God is really the object of our love and desire. And no matter where we're at on the journey of life, that God is with us and that God gives us, in a sense, what we need. So be grateful to your parents, to your mom and dad, to your caregivers, to whoever gives you an allowance. I think that's important. But also kind of learn how to use those gifts you have. Now, as I looked at this story, I also thought back to the first job that I ever had. And the first actual job I had was in junior high in Chicago, and I was mopping the floors and cleaning the floors of an auto parts store. And I remember back then I got $2 an hour. And I think some of the other people there probably got $10 or $12 an hour. They got a lot more, but I was just starting out. But I was really grateful even for that $2 an hour because I could save it to go to college someday, right? And I could also use some of that money for some of the things that I wanted. So really this whole story is really about the goodness of life, the goodness of work, and being grateful for what we have and living into that. So thanks for sharing this story with me today. We are grateful that you are here, and we want you to know that all of you who are children or young people, we value and appreciate you here at First Church, and we also value the young at heart. So thank you for being present.